March 4, 1918. The largest naval auxiliary vessel in the United States fleet steams out of Barbados Harbor, carrying 11,000 tons of manganese, ore, a critical material for steel production during World War I. The USS Cyclops, a 542-foot cargo ship with 306 souls aboard, is bound for Baltimore with cargo worth millions in today's currency. She never arrives. No distress signal is ever received. No wreckage is ever found. No survivor ever tells her story. The USS Cyclops simply vanishes from the face of the Earth, taking with her not just 306 human lives, but also enough strategic materials to build dozens of warships for the Allied cause. But here's what makes this disappearance truly disturbing, and what most people don't know about this cornerstone case of Bermuda Triangle mythology. The USS Cyclops wasn't just any cargo ship. She was carrying materials so vital to the war effort that losing them potentially changed the course of World War I. And the man commanding this vessel had a background that would make any intelligence officer deeply suspicious. You've probably heard the basic story of the USS Cyclops, a ship that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle during World War I, never to be seen again. Most accounts treat it as an inexplicable maritime mystery, another vessel claimed by the supernatural forces supposedly at work in this region. But what if I told you that the real story of the Cyclops reveals something far more complex and potentially more sinister than any supernatural explanation? The standard narrative focuses on the mystery of the disappearance itself. Where did this massive ship go? How could something so large vanish without a trace? These are certainly compelling questions, but they miss the deeper story hiding in the official records and witness testimonies that survived from 1918. In this video, I'm going to take you through the actual evidence surrounding the USS Cyclops case, her construction and design flaws, the suspicious circumstances of her final voyage, the background of her German-born captain, and the strategic implications of losing such a massive cargo of war materials. We'll examine why the Navy's investigation into her disappearance was classified for decades, and what the declassified documents reveal about what officials really believed happened to the Cyclops. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this case became foundational to Bermuda Triangle mythology, but more importantly, you'll see how the true story of the USS Cyclops intersects with World War I espionage, industrial sabotage, and the kinds of wartime secrets that nations prefer to keep buried. To understand why the loss of this single ship was so devastating to the American war effort, we need to examine the vessel herself. Let me start with the ship herself, because understanding the USS Cyclops means understanding why her disappearance was so significant to the American war effort. The Cyclops wasn't just another merchant vessel. She was specifically designed and built to transport the massive quantities of raw materials that modern industrial warfare demanded. Launched in 1910, the USS Cyclops was what naval architects called a fleet auxiliary, a specialized cargo vessel designed to supply military operations anywhere in the world. At 542 feet long and capable of carrying over 11,000 tons of cargo, she was one of the largest ships of her type in the world. Her cavernous holds could transport everything from coal and oil to ammunition and heavy machinery. But the Cyclops had a critical design flaw that would prove prophetic. The ship's structure was built around a single massive cargo hold that ran almost the entire length of the vessel. While this design maximized cargo capacity, it created serious problems with structural integrity. The ship had a tendency to develop stress fractures in heavy seas, and her steel plates were known to work loose under the enormous weight of full cargo loads. Naval engineers had identified these structural problems during the ship's construction, but with war approaching, the Navy decided to keep her in service despite the risks. After all, America needed every available cargo vessel to transport the materials that would fuel the Allied war machine. The Cyclops spent her early years transporting coal, steel, and other materials throughout the Caribbean and along the East Coast. Her crews reported that the ship was difficult to handle in rough weather, and several officers noted in their reports that she exhibited unusual behavior in heavy seas, rolling excessively and making strange creaking sounds that suggested structural stress. By 1918, with America fully committed to the European war, ships like the Cyclops had become absolutely critical to the war effort. The industrial scale of World War I meant that victory would go to whichever side could produce more steel, more ammunition, and more ships than their enemies. And steel production required massive quantities of manganese ore, exactly the cargo that the Cyclops was carrying on her final voyage. But the ship's structural problems were just one piece of a much more complex puzzle. The man commanding this vulnerable vessel had a background that would raise serious questions. Now, here's where the story begins to take on a more sinister dimension, and it involves the man who was commanding the USS Cyclops during her final voyage. Captain George Washington Worley was a naturalized American citizen, but he had been born in Germany and had immigrated to the United States as a young man. In 1918, with anti-German sentiment running high throughout America, Worley's background made him a subject of suspicion among Navy intelligence officers. German saboteurs had already been caught attempting to destroy American shipping and industrial facilities. The idea that a German-born captain might be involved in some form of sabotage or espionage was not just possible. It was a constant concern for military authorities. But Captain Worley's behavior during the Cyclops' final voyage raised even more red flags among those who later investigated the ship's disappearance. Instead of following standard naval procedures and maintaining regular radio contact with shore stations, Worley had been operating the ship in an increasingly secretive manner. The Cyclops had departed from Barbados on March 4, 1918, bound for Baltimore with her cargo of manganese ore. According to standard procedure, Worley should have maintained regular radio contact with naval stations along the East Coast, reporting his position and estimated arrival time. Instead, the ship went silent almost immediately after leaving port. This radio silence wasn't necessarily unusual in itself. Many ships maintained radio silence during wartime to avoid detection by enemy submarines. But what was unusual was that Worley had failed to file a detailed sailing plan with naval authorities in Barbados, and he had made several unauthorized stops during the ship's voyage south from New York. These unauthorized stops are crucial to understanding what may have happened to the Cyclops, because they suggest that Captain Worley was operating outside of normal naval command structure. Intelligence reports from 1918 indicate that Worley had been in contact with individuals in the Caribbean who were suspected of having German connections. One particularly disturbing detail emerges from the witness testimony of crew members who had served aboard the Cyclops during earlier voyages. Several sailors reported that Captain Worley had been making unusual modifications to the ship's cargo handling equipment, ostensibly to improve loading efficiency. But some crew members suspected that these modifications were actually designed to make it easier to jettison cargo overboard without detection. These suspicious circumstances take on even greater significance when you consider the strategic value of what the Cyclops was carrying. Think about what this might mean. If Captain Worley was involved in some form of sabotage or espionage operation, the most effective way to damage the American war effort wouldn't necessarily be to sink the ship outright. It would be to dispose of the cargo, those 11,000 tons of manganese ore that were desperately needed for steel production, while making it appear that the entire ship had been lost to natural causes. This theory gains credibility when you examine the strategic importance of the Cyclops cargo. Manganese ore was absolutely critical to steel production during World War I. Without adequate supplies of manganese, steel becomes brittle and unsuitable for military applications. The cargo aboard the Cyclops represented enough manganese to produce steel for dozens of warships, thousands of artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition. Losing this cargo would have been a serious blow to American war production, potentially delaying the manufacture of critical military equipment by months. For German intelligence services, arranging the loss of such a cargo would have been a major strategic victory, equivalent to sinking several warships or destroying a major industrial facility. The timing of the Cyclops' disappearance also supports this theory. March 1918 was a critical period in World War I. Germany was preparing for their final major offensive on the Western Front, and American industrial production was ramping up to support the massive influx of American troops arriving in Europe. Disrupting American supply lines at this moment could have had significant impact on the war's outcome. But if Captain Worley was involved in sabotaging his own ship, how did he plan to escape? This is where the mystery deepens, because there's evidence to suggest that Worley may have had an escape plan that went tragically wrong. Intelligence reports from the period indicate that German submarines were operating in the Caribbean during early 1918, and that these submarines were occasionally used to extract German agents from Allied territories. If Worley had arranged to rendezvous with a German submarine after disposing of his cargo, he may have planned to escape to Germany, where he would be celebrated as a hero of the war effort. But submarine rendezvous operations were extremely dangerous, even under the best of conditions. If something went wrong, if the submarine was delayed, if weather conditions made the transfer impossible, or if American naval forces detected the operation, Worley and his crew could have found themselves stranded at sea with no way to call for help. This scenario could explain several puzzling aspects of the Cyclops case. It would explain why no distress signal was ever received. If Worley was trying to maintain secrecy, he wouldn't have used the ship's radio even in an emergency. It would explain why no wreckage was ever found. If the ship sank in deep water during a clandestine operation, she could have gone down in an area where no search vessels would think to look. But the sabotage theory isn't the only explanation the Navy considered. There was also the very real possibility that the ship's structural problems finally caught up with her. Most importantly, it would explain why the Navy's investigation into the disappearance remained classified for decades. If naval intelligence suspected that the Cyclops had been lost due to sabotage by her own captain, they would have had strong reasons to keep this information secret. Publicizing such a case would have damaged morale, raised questions about security procedures, and potentially compromised ongoing counterintelligence operations. The declassified Navy documents that became available decades later provide some support for this theory. The official investigation files contain numerous references to security concerns and classified aspects of the case that can't be discussed in public reports. Several naval intelligence officers who worked on the investigation later indicated in private correspondence that they believed the ship's disappearance was not accidental. But there's another possibility that the official investigation considered, and it involves the structural problems that had plagued the Cyclops throughout her service career. Naval architects who examined the ship's design and maintenance records concluded that she could have suffered a catastrophic structural failure under the enormous weight of her manganese ore cargo. Here's what makes this theory so compelling. Manganese ore is incredibly dense, much heavier than the coal or general cargo that the Cyclops typically carried. Loading 11,000 tons of manganese ore would have put stresses on the ship's hull that were far beyond what her designers had anticipated. If the cargo shifted during heavy weather, or if the ship's already weakened structure finally gave way under the load, the Cyclops could have broken apart and sunk so quickly that there was no time to send a distress signal. This structural failure theory is supported by reports from other ships of similar design. Several vessels in the Cyclops class experienced serious structural problems during their service careers, and at least 2 others were lost under circumstances that suggested catastrophic hull failure. The combination of design flaws, heavy cargo, and rough seas could have created conditions that no ship could survive. Weather records from March 1918 show that the Cyclops would have encountered severe storms during her voyage north from Barbados. These storms brought high winds, large waves, and the kind of conditions that could cause cargo to shift and place enormous stresses on a ship's hull. If the Cyclops' already weakened structure couldn't handle these conditions, she could have broken apart and sunk within minutes. The rapid sinking theory would explain why no distress signal was received, and why no survivors were ever found. It would also explain why no wreckage was discovered despite extensive search operations. A ship that breaks apart and sinks in deep water can scatter debris over a wide area, and in 1918, search and rescue operations didn't have the sophisticated equipment needed to locate wreckage on the ocean floor. But even these explanations leave crucial questions unanswered, pointing to a more complex truth that combines elements of both theories. But even this explanation leaves some questions unanswered. Why were the Cyclops' sister ships, which had similar structural problems, able to continue operating for years after the Cyclops disappeared? Why didn't other vessels carrying similar cargoes experience comparable failures? And why did the Navy continue to classify aspects of the investigation if the ship's loss was simply due to structural failure. These questions point to a third possibility that combines elements of both the sabotage and structural failure theories. What if Captain Worley was indeed involved in a sabotage operation, but the plan went wrong when the ship's structural problems caused her to sink before the cargo could be safely transferred? This scenario would explain the classified aspects of the Navy's investigation. They would have had evidence of sabotage attempts, but they couldn't prove whether the sabotage was successful or whether the ship was lost due to structural failure. It would also explain why no wreckage was found in the areas where search operations focused. If Worley had diverted the ship from her planned course for a clandestine meeting, she could have sunk in a completely different location. What makes the USS Cyclops case so frustrating for researchers is that the most crucial evidence, the ship herself, has never been found. Without the physical evidence that could definitively prove what happened, we're left to piece together the story from incomplete records, contradictory witness testimony, and declassified documents that raise as many questions as they answer. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Cyclops case isn't about what happened to one ship in 1918. It's about how wartime pressures can create conditions where normal safety procedures break down, where individual decisions can have strategic consequences, and where the line between accident and sabotage becomes impossible to determine. The USS Cyclops disappeared during a period when the stakes of maritime transportation couldn't have been higher. Every cargo ship that reached port safely brought materials that could turn the tide of the war. Every ship that was lost represented not just economic damage, but potential military defeat. In this environment, even routine cargo operations became matters of national security. Captain George Washington Worley found himself at the center of this high-stakes environment, commanding a ship that was carrying materials vital to his adopted country's war effort, while dealing with suspicion about his loyalty due to his German birth. Whether he ultimately proved loyal or traitorous, competent or incompetent, may be less important than understanding how the pressures of total war could transform a routine cargo voyage into a mystery that has persisted for over a century. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops reminds us that some of history's greatest mysteries arise not from supernatural forces or inexplicable phenomena, but from the intersection of human ambition, technological limitations, and the fog of war that can obscure the truth about events even as they're happening. The next time someone mentions the Bermuda Triangle or the mysterious disappearances that supposedly occur there, remember the USS Cyclops and the very human story behind her vanishing. This wasn't a case of supernatural forces or inexplicable phenomena. It was the story of a ship, a crew, and a captain caught in the machinery of global war, where every decision carried enormous stakes, and where the difference between heroism and treason could be measured in the fate of 11,000 tons of manganese or sitting in a cargo hold. What do you think really happened to the USS Cyclops and her 306 souls? The mystery endures, but the human story behind it reveals truths about war, loyalty, and the price of secrets that nations prefer to keep buried.